whisper, "Is that him?" The president glanced through the glass wall at the man in the red jacket and brown trousers pacing the room. Yes, he still doesn't quite understand why we've asked him here. The leader of the North American superpower allowed himself the faintest curl of a smile. Not surprising. Professor Antonius was not so much bewildered as mildly irritated. Not an hour ago, he had been presenting at a symposium on the strategic challenges of deep space exploration, making the case against the impracticality and empty pretension of certain projects that had captured the public imagination. A few hours later, he was sitting in the pleasant cafe one floor below, surrounded by colleagues, relaxed and rambling agreeably about nothing in particular. Then, in the middle of a light-hearted conversation, a short man in grey appeared at his elbow, produced credentials, and politely asked him to come along. Professor Antonius had not dared to refuse. Perhaps it was something in his blood. His Slavic mother's instilled reverence for authority. "Please sit," said the man across from him at last, a man that a scientist of his modest standing had little reason to ever expect seeing in person. There was a brief silence. The president drummed his fingers on the mirrored surface of the table. "You were involved in reviewing the asteroid belt mineral extraction project?" "I was. The project proved to have no viable prospects at this time, as I demonstrated through several examples. The artificial intelligence, on which so many hopes were pinned, is incapable of handling many unpredictable situations. I presented a partial list to the assembly. Self-replication presents its own separate problem, the precision required under the given conditions. As he tried to render his paper in plain language, he couldn't shake a nagging sense of bewilderment. Since when did the leader of the United States of America take an interest in asteroid mining, that thoroughly theoretical project, cooked up by enthusiasts and riding a wave of populist attention into the headlines? "Your colleagues tell me you weren't especially pleased with your own findings," the president remarked quietly, leafing through some papers. The professor winced. "I think very few people go into the space sector with the intention of putting the brakes on space exploration, Mr. President. If my research had pointed the other way, I would have been the first to celebrate." The president nodded thoughtfully, still turning pages. Then, abruptly, "What were you and your colleagues discussing downstairs after the presentation, if you don't mind my asking? Forgive me if that's a little forward." "Oh, that. The usual off-the-record shop talk. We started by joking about the old Titanomachy-scale approaches to space travel, Orion-type pulse drives, that sort of thing. Then the conversation drifted to generation ships as a concept. Hawkins brought up the Biosphere 2 debacle, that old experiment in trying to create a self-sustaining closed ecosystem under a glass dome, as evidence that the whole generation ship idea is fragile and fundamentally unstable. You argued that the central problem of the generation ship is not technical or biological, but social. It wasn't a question. The president stated it as fact. Well, yes. Psychology and sociology are outside my field, you understand. It was just loose talk over a glass of Chianti. Nervous. Anyone can see that human society is something fundamentally difficult to control. If there were a button on Earth right now, a button that would destroy the planet or send it spinning backward around the sun, someone would have pressed it 10,000 times over by now. Consequences be damned. Any generation ship sent to the stars, carrying thousands of people across centuries, is more likely to blow itself up or turn back, or at least make the attempt, than to complete its mission as intended. Psychohistory equations remain a fantasy, and the obvious antidote, building some kind of iron regime with a sacred ideology baked into the ship's culture, is just as unreliable as every attempt to build a totalitarian system on Earth. There's disappointment in your voice, the president said softly. He reached into a cabinet, produced a bottle of pale golden liquid and 2 glasses, then looked at his guest questioningly. Professor Antonius hesitated a moment, then nodded. You see, the supreme irony is that building a generation ship is theoretically well within the bounds of our existing science and engineering. It requires no exotic dark energy, as the Alcubierre warp drive does, no annihilation drives, no solution to the problem of neutralizing the countless hydrogen particles drifting through interstellar space. In principle, we could construct such a ship, perhaps not this century, but the next. Is it practical? You argued that asteroid belt mining is not economically viable. Sending drones to the asteroid belt does not expand the range of human habitation. Life on a single planet is like keeping all your eggs in one basket. Mr. President, his host allowed a thin smile, just at the corner of his mouth. Some people put their hopes in Mars. Mars is, in fact, the only remotely viable foothold available to us within the solar system at our current stage of development. Especially if we abandon the fantasy of open-air living and instead commit to a hyper-urbanist civilization. Enclosed spaces, subways, underground caverns, hydroponic farms. He fell quiet for a moment. The president said, nothing either, both men taking their time with the pale golden drink. So where did the conversation go from there? I'm told you got into rather more, shall we say, speculative territory. That was still the generation ship, really? Duplessis threw out the idea of a ship carrying frozen eggs and sperm, delivered to the destination in cryo-storage, thawed and combined on arrival, with the resulting children raised by automated systems. After a few pointed remarks about what level of AI that would require, he tried to refine the concept. Keep 10 or so living crew aboard the whole time, periodically growing their own replacements, and use the final generation to found the colony. His argument was that 10 people can keep a better eye on 10 people's mental states, but the room laughed him down. My own contribution was suitably sarcastic, in the spirit of those old Hollywood films. The idea being, if people are genuinely too volatile to transport, if over 1,000 years of flight they will inevitably destroy the ship or each other, then let's package them as securely as eggs in a carton. Suspended animation? Not with current technology, I'm afraid. Then what did you mean by packing them like eggs? Exactly what it says on the label. Immobilizing the passengers, eliminating any possibility of harm, to themselves or to the ship. You see, the physical condition of the body and muscles can be maintained at an adequate level by automated systems without any actual physical activity. Reproduction itself can likewise be automated. The development of the mind, social interaction, all the rest. These could be handled through the ship's communications network, which would generate something like a virtual reality to connect the crew members with one another. And wouldn't it be dreadfully dull, lying in restraints for years on end with a VR headset strapped to your face? Dull, yes. Dull, but only if you know you're inside a virtual world. The president was quiet for a moment. Then he tapped his fingers on the table. Now I understand which old Hollywood film you mentioned earlier. The Matrix. Precisely. And since you've brought it up, the scenario depicted in that film is arguably the most elegant solution to the generation ship problem. If a person doesn't know they're inside a virtual reality, they won't want to leave it. If a person doesn't know they're on a generation ship, they won't want to break it. But do our technologies actually allow us to create a virtual reality that convincing? I had the impression you were trying to stay within the bounds of realistic, near-future technology. Convincing? Who said anything about convincing? If from the moment of your birth you were sealed into a virtual suit and visor that showed you the world in black and white, you would never once suspect that other colors existed. Moreover, it's precisely the difference between the virtual world and the real one that would make the ship safer, that would raise its reliability ceiling. The less a person can conceive of external reality, the less able they'll be to navigate it, and the less damage they can do. In the unlikely event, they fall out of the virtual world due to a network failure or some other cause. It's therefore far more practical to model the virtual reality on fantastical templates, perhaps even fairy tale ones, so that its inhabitants have no conception whatsoever of how the real world works, while still providing an environment in which the mind can fully develop. The president turned the stem of his crystal glass slowly between his fingers. But wouldn't that be a liability in the final stage of the journey? What use is a colony of people raised on fairy tales when the ship actually arrives somewhere? This brings us to another cynical wrinkle in that dinner party theory of mine, meaning, first, there could easily be a small privileged group aboard, people who know, wholly or in part, what is actually happening and who are capable of preparing the rest of the crew for it when the time comes. They would administer the virtual reality, adjusting its laws as needed and managing the interlocking threads of the passengers' lives. Unlike the traditional generation ship scenario, this group would have genuinely powerful psychological incentives to guard the secret and protect the mission's objective. The desire to preserve their power, their access to the virtual world's riches. The president's hand halted halfway to setting down his glass. And second, herein lies the second cynical wrinkle. As I said, the laws of the virtual world could shift gradually with each generation that brings the ship closer to its destination. The virtual world might begin in a state that is relatively hospitable, almost generous, toward its inhabitants, as if compensating them for the moral cost of the journey, voluntary or otherwise. But over time, it would need to harden. If the virtual world's laws begin far removed from reality, oriented more toward developing moral character than developing practical intelligence, then in the final centuries of the voyage, they must become progressively more realistic and cognitively demanding, so that people are ready to fulfill the mission. The professor glanced down at his own glass and found it empty. He sighed. Expulsion from paradise is inevitable. The unicorns and fairies must eventually give way to the precise laws of physics. Beautiful. The president let the word fall and then sat in silence for a few seconds, as though digesting everything he'd just heard. Then, with a hesitance that seemed odd in a man of his position, he cleared his throat. You're probably wondering why I invited you here. The thing is, there's something I wanted to show you. He snapped his fingers, and everything disappeared. Fearful, marshalling a superhuman effort of will against the blind panic that surged through him in the darkness, Professor Antonius managed, with enormous difficulty, to blink several times and bring his vision back into focus. He was lying in an elongated chamber of strange geometry, convex and concave at once, its walls defying any logic he could name, doing something wrong to his mind. He raised a trembling hand above him. It blurred before his eyes. Each finger was sharp and distinct only when he looked directly at it. The moment his gaze moved on, it dissolved into a hazy smear. Nervous quantum effects at the macroscopic scale. The mad thought surfaced and was gone. Something scraped nearby. We are, in fact, quite a small group, Professor. The president's voice came from a device on the adjacent wall, resonant, distorted, but recognizable, which is why we require new members from time to time. Fearful new members, the professor whispered, and did not recognize his own voice. People capable of perceiving the truth and remaining sane afterward. The wall above him disappeared, or dissolved. No, he thought, with an involuntary flicker of relief. It's only a screen. Because if it weren't, the screen showed the bottomless black of space, with trembling pinpoints of stars scattered across it. Sad. Welcome aboard the generation ship of the real world, Professor Antonius. Here, the president's voice faltered. Whisper, and this ship's voyage is nearly at its end.